something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's episode of Occupy TV. With me tonight is Gene Stacy, and we'll be discussing the closing of the Occupy Eugene camp in December and January this past holidays. My name is John Monroe. Thank you for coming. Gene, would you like to open up with a few words about the closing?
Well, I think the closing was an unnecessary blemish on the relationship between the city and Occupy, which up until that time really each group had cooperated well with the other, and I think there was a strong recognition on the part of the city of the value of the occupation to the city. But with the closure of the camp, I think all of the trust that Occupy had worked hard to cultivate with the city was totally destroyed by the way the police interpreted, rightly or wrongly, the instructions from the council with regard to the shutdown of the camp.
And you say that there's a blemish that's been caused. I was wondering if you could speak a little more about that.
Well, you and I were the police liaisons. And so we were probably more intimately familiar with what went on than some other folks, both on the police force and within the Occupy camp. And we were told constantly one thing by Lieutenant Kamkar, who was our liaison and whom I have a great respect for. But it seemed in the actual implementation of what happened as if he were a figure totally separate from the rest of the police force. However, you and I know that he was not separate because he was constantly on the telephone before he changed any of his orders with us. And so I totally lost faith in a man whom I respect because I felt that he was being used really to implement policies that he did or didn't agree with. But I thought it was a bad thing to do to a good man.
It really was, and I think I saw that in a number of officers on site, was that there was a kind of institutional force that was pushing these officers. One thing that I've never been able to get over was an observation that a friend of mine that was born and raised in Eugene made, that he's never seen at night either the old or the new federal building so busy as around the time of the camp closure. And I honestly have to wonder, up to this point, how much pressure was coming through whatever federal agencies, probably Department of Homeland Security primarily, on what levels of the police, who was being told to do what to close us down.
I agree, John. I think several of us did see vehicles that we knew that were clearly labeled as being federal near the camp. I think you'd have to have your eyes shut not to realize that what happened here in Eugene was exactly what happened in virtually every city in the United States. We'd have to be deaf not to know 18 mayors got in a telephone conversation and jointly planned what was going to happen. So
with
there was a national, yes, and there was a national shutdown, and we were part of it.
We were part of it, and it makes us wonder, and there's been a lot of reaction to our discontent with what happened, and a lot of flinging of a couple key accusations, one of which is that we're basically putting out conspiracy theories, that the police never do things like suppress protest or dissidence movements, and that there are a lot of kind of personal interests at stake within Occupy Eugene that are using the camp closure to push their own agendas. And I think that those are two very useful ideas to continue to attack Occupy Eugene. They're also very useful ideas to continue to cover over the problem of the treatment of the homeless in Eugene, which was part and parcel of the closure of the camp shutdown. One thing, in order to kind of put context on what's happened, one of the major reactions to the closing of the camp was the infamous action at Councillor Polling's house by a group from Occupy Eugene.
Right.
And that's been taken as its own kind of independent action that was in poor standing, bad taste, or downright offensive, depending on the person you talk to. What has failed to be brought up to light, though, was that a lot of the people involved in that protest had been pushed out on Christmas Eve by the police department
Right.
They had been pushed out because of votes made by the counselor, and the counselor himself served on the Eugene Police Department for almost 20 years before becoming a counselor.
Right.
So of anyone on the counselor, on the city council, he seemed to represent that same strain of thought and habit and behavior that was trying to close us down.
Right. I know he had been in law enforcement for many years. I'm not sure if it was EPD or sheriff.
I think you're right, Sheriff. Sheriff is, I think.
But it certainly, he reflects the mentality. I think he was also targeted not only because of his personal background, but by how that background expressed itself when it came to the issue of having fires in the camp.
That was awesome.
You and many people, as well as myself, were at the camp. It was cold as it could be. The police had recommended, in fact, that we be allowed to have fires in a big barrel and totally safe precautions. And George Poling prevented the council, who clearly was going to allow us to be warm for our few remaining nights, he prevented them from being able to express that and give the directive for us to be able to have fires. And so even in the face of a police recommendation, his old training came out, and he imposed this very hateful things. I personally, I did not go to Poling's house because I wasn't invited, but I think the action was very appropriate. There was a lot of talk that, oh, you shouldn't go to council people's homes. Well, one, this is an American tradition that has lasted forever. People go to elected officials' homes all the time. But this was a man who had taken part, and a vicious part, in evicting 250 or more people from their warm beds and their safety and their food on the table a few nights before Christmas, after promising that we could stay there until after Christmas. So people fled and had to leave all their belongings behind because they couldn't plan. And he did this, and then he wonders why we come up and stand on his front lawn and stand on his sidewalk and quietly protest. I think it couldn't have been more appropriate. He violated 250 people's homes, and all Occupy did was stand in front of his home and protest. So I thought it was appropriate.
I thought it was appropriate. I thought he singled himself out as against those, for example, Councilors Clark and Farr that were against us in the pettiness and in the personal attacks. The other critics, I felt, always kept it on the level of specific issues. And for whatever disagreements I have with them, they kept it more or less what I would call an honorable playing field.
Very honorable, I think.
Whereas what the two things that really strike me before and after is first that Councillor Poling used a technicality.
Yes.
He refused to agree to talk about having campfires. He didn't even bring it up to vote. He didn't even let the other seven councillor people vote on it because he knew that it would have passed. And he used this little technical power to keep people out. He also used that same technicality to buy himself a new fence, to buy himself a motion sensor light or camera or something. Anyway, it costs the taxpayers of Eugene $7,000. And then we've recently found out another $6,000 were used to protect him with personal police
from
people.
About that.
Oh, yes. The total has now come out to $13,000.
You're kidding.
That Councillor Poling has been able to manipulate the system for his own personal benefit. And I don't think the people of Eugene should be looking at it as anything different. This was not his personal defense.
No.
He nor his family were never personally threatened.
No.
It's ridiculous. If we're going to pretend that he's an elected official that supposedly represents the population.
And a sheriff of 20 years.
And a sheriff of 20
years. He must have been terrified.
I know. And then he uses it. And he uses it even while still saying that we were abusing the system. I mean, the man should be taken out of office. It's despicable.
Well, and I thought one of the lower levels of what he did was to turn around and attack the mayor and say that this woman, who I suppose is in her 60s, I think she's around my age, should have done more to protect a 20-year veteran of this sheriff's office. And I thought, oh, if he is not showing his colors, I don't know who is.
And so that's the second way that we've kind of lost faith in our law enforcement. On the one hand, we've seen a gentleman that I believe most people that worked with him respected. Lieutenant Kamkar was the one person we really felt kind of understood where we were coming from. And he was put in an institutional position
Yeah.
where we have a hard time trusting him now.
Yeah.
Then we have another person that is a product of this system, that is an elected official, that if we don't call him corrupt, I don't know who is on the local level. He's taken personal money for personal benefit. He's manipulated rules in order to make his own personal opinions powerful over other people.
Right.
It's just despicable. But probably one of the most infamous things within Occupy Eugene, but is not very well known publicly. I mean, we know about the closing of the camp, and we know about polling. Everyone knows that name, for better or for worse. But is the memorandum that was circulated by the infamous, for those that know, memorandum circulated by the Eugene Police Employees Association. Now, this is a very interesting organization. For those that don't know, there is, and this is very standard for, I guess now, police departments to have throughout the country, is a police union. These police unions have their own kind of communication systems throughout the country. They have their own kind of networks. This is an area of research that we're still developing. But I find it interesting on a number of levels. First, it's interesting because it's a police union. If you look at the history of workers' rights and resistances in this country, it's traditionally been a battle between workers' unions and then whatever form of repressive police was being used. I mean, it's been personal detectives, police, National Guard have been used by business interests for as long as there's been political resistance. But now we have this strange blending of the union with all its legal protections that have been developed over the last 150 years, and then the police with all of their legal protections. And we have this very, very interesting thing called the police union, which doesn't have to report to the public, which can keep all of its internal communications secret. The letter that we found was just happened to get passed on to us by a interested party, and protects and has a lot of say on the city government. It was this memorandum that triggered having a patrol of 3 to 4 police 24/7 on the site. It was this memorandum that triggered having, I believe, was it 4 stadium lights on a single park block from dusk till dawn, which basically meant that there was never dark. And this is a standard tactic.
And with generators that were running at very high noise level.
Those lights, that noise, those are standard tactics that are used by federal agents when they're sieging a place. These are tactics that are used by Israeli police and Israeli military against the occupation in Palestine. These are typical anti-terror or territorial aggressive maneuvers.
They're used for torture.
And they're used for torture, so-called interrogation techniques in black cells and whatever, were used against citizens, political dissidents, by a local police agency. So what we've seen, we've personally experienced, you, myself, and even more so for many of the homeless that couldn't get away. I had the fortune to have a place to go at night. But many people that were exposed to that full time have now had basically paramilitary, militarized police action used against them.
Exactly.
And one of the massive untalked about questions out there is who is dealing with the trauma to those people that were aggressively, psychologically attacked. And we can't call it anything else, but an attack by the police, an attack by the police union. What's being done about the trauma? I
don't think anything, John, and it didn't stop there. It continued. I had a conversation with the chief of police, Pete Kearns, prior to the shutdown, in which he continued to assure me that there was no shutdown date, that there absolutely was not. This is in spite of our conversations with Lieutenant Kamkar, first for the 24th of December. And remember, we told him, Sam, that would look really bad for the city if you kick us all out on New Year's Eve. And he said, you got a point. And he made a phone call. And then he came back to us that night and said, yeah, we're going to do it on the 26th. And then the eviction notices were placed the very next day on the 21st.
Would you like to maybe give people a picture of how that was working?
Yes. We had been told, you and I as the liaisons, and had announced to the camp that we'd all be able to spend Christmas together and that we would need to start showing a rapid decline in population over that time. And we presented that to everybody, and they showed the rapid decline. We took down all of our large buildings immediately, in fact. In spite of that, I believe it was the night of the 21st, they began putting the notices on every single tent that said, the park is closed. You must take all of your things and leave. And then they told people that they had to leave by 11 o'clock the next morning. While that was going on, while I was witnessing it, Chief Kearns is telling me nothing like this is going on. I resent that. It frightens me that not that we were being shut down in such a bad way, but that the chief of police was continuing to suggest that there was no shutdown date. I, in fact, called the mayor about it because I was so upset that they had said shut it down in an expeditious but reasonable manner, and here we were being shut down immediately. And she said she was told the same thing by the police, that there was no shutdown happening immediately. But then I go in and there's an email from Sam Kamkar exactly outlining what was in fact happening on the ground.
Exactly. And again, we see what I think most people that were on the experiencing side of this within the camp feel was a completely inappropriate tactic.
It was unnecessary.
It was unnecessary.
We were shutting down.
But it really draws to me in mind the question of what the long-term goals of these kind of tactics that are being used when one group is clearly conflicting with another group. When the chief of police is saying one thing, when our liaison is saying another thing, this is just classic disinformation. It's a standard military tactic. It's a standard diplomatic tactic. It's what you do to what you perceive as an enemy.
And we are not the enemy.
Exactly. So the fact that the city government, agents of the city government, were working in such a way that...
Duplicitous is a kind word.
Duplicitous is a kind word, and but I feel treated as if we were an enemy, a diplomatically, kissed one, being that, they certainly wanted to come out looking good. But these were tactics that we could go over to Israel, we could go over to Eastern Europe in certain periods and see parallels.
I know, and John, to somebody like me, a young man like you with your background and your education and your experience, that's not a big surprise probably because you've informed yourself over time. I'm 66. I grew up believing in my country, believing in the police and whatnot, but I retired about 15 years ago and have had time to begin learning and rethinking some of my worldview. And frankly, all of this comes as a shock to me. It's a huge adjustment. So I really do understand people who are sitting out there and saying, this couldn't be true. I would have been sitting there saying the same thing very recently. But my perspective has been changed by information and by experience. And I think everybody really needs to rethink their worldview and their view of what's going on in our community. Because some of the things that are happening are very egregious, and they are representative of things that are happening on a national level and an international level, as you pointed out.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's people that kind of bring up the underside history of the United States are often attacked as being unpatriotic or hating their country or being against freedom, and I don't think it's anything like that. I don't think being uncritical is a sign of being free. I think it's a sign of being conforming. And learning to look at the difference between an idea of the United States, which I think in many ways is beautiful and can be very inspiring, versus the actuality of what's happening on the ground, enables us to move from this, which is very undemocratic, to this, which has the potential to be very democratic.
But John, it is so uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable
for all of us in particular that are older. It's terribly discomforting because if all the institutions that we believed in, trusted with our safety and security, are now in an oppositional framework, where does that leave us? And I think I've been personally inspired by a lot of the things you first brought out at the beginning of Occupy about the formation of a civil society in which people really do look out for each other. And this is one of the things that I think we're seeing in this police situation, is the police are not looking out for everybody. They're playing a totally different agenda. Those of us who remained in the camp, I slept at that camp for a long time, and I know you did too. And when my asthma got so bad I couldn't stay, I would go back and sit in a lawn chair with Elena, my partner, and Lucy, my service dog, and we'd talk to people all night. I never in one moment felt unsafe in that camp. And then this letter talks about armed police officers who in groups walking through the camp feeling afraid and unsafe. I actually wrote a letter to them and said, don't worry, I had to leave town for a couple of nights, but I'll be back. Everything will be all right. I'll take care of you.
Let me pull out one section
Yes.
of this just to give some context.
Right.
This is a memorandum published December 16th, 2011, for Mayor Kitty Piercy and all the members of the Eugene City Council from the Eugene the Eugene Police Employees Association Executive Board. This particular statement is I find just absolutely can't believe it was even brought up.
It was
Quote,
so ludicrous.
"We are not against the Occupy movement in the least. However, very little of that movement appears to remain in this camp. Our officers are being followed around, taunted, threatened, tormented, and insulted while they are in the camp. When there are officers inside the fence with only one possible avenue to escape against over 150 people who have made it clear they are willing to harm them, there is no amount of equipment or police tactics that make it safe for our officers to enforce the law." And then just to throw in this last little bit, they say, "There are human feces, vomit, and other biohazards on the muddy paths that our officers are forced to walk." This statement, had it been issued by an actually governmental organization, could have been sued for defamation.
Oh, yes.
This is blatantly false. But because it's protected by the police union, they can get away with it. Now let's just
And because it's played in the media, who has little concern for truth.
Exactly, and they say earlier, based on the information provided to the local media and the information we have obtained from our representative members, i.e. the police, we believe that there is an unacceptable compromise to the safety of our local police officers who enter the site. Now notice here that they have absolutely no information obtained by people within the camp that are not police. They say that there are 150 people who have made it clear. I never saw incidences of more than a few people who, I understand they were aggressive towards the cops. We have to understand there's a long history and that the police are not innocent entities.
Right.
They themselves have shown policies of harassment towards the homeless. They are not well respected amongst the poor in this town, and that's across the board.
Right.
Poor house people also don't like the police for the standard policies. And it's not that the police are made up of nefarious individuals.
No.
Again, I think this is an institutional problem. The police system is used against the poor.
Right.
That's been shown again and again. Now, here, the statement about human feces, vomit, other biohazards, we saw that. We walked, just like any other space, there were, of course, areas that were not clean. To say that on the muddy paths all over the place there were biohazards was an absolute exaggeration.
And that the feces were human without a lab test.
Oh, exactly. We had dogs running around.
We did have dogs.
And we had people cleaning it up on a regular basis. We had an entire group for sanitation. All things considered, and by that I mean with very little monetary financing, that camp was about as clean as it could get, which admittedly wasn't as clean as we would have liked it, but was by no means a biohazard. Now, the other thing that's interesting is if you take an average police officer, for example, in Eugene, they're armed with a sidearm, a pistol with 2 extra clips on them. They have mace, pepper spray. They have a taser gun, which shoots at a distance. They have a billy club. They also have both their cell phone and their radio pack, and they have a large mag light flashlight that can double as another weapon. And there were always 3 to 4 police officers when this letter was issued on camp. How, in any way, shape, or form, are they going to be threatened by person? One person gets shot or tased, and the rest of the group's going to back out.
This is a reflection of what we just talked about George Polling. How can a man who's 20-year sheriff be afraid of 8 women, 2 of whom were children, and 4 men who are outside his house? I mean, it's absurd. This is absurd.
It is absurd, and yet this absurdity helped precipitate the camp shutdown.
Absolutely.
This was more than, there was an overall trend. I don't know how things would have happened without this letter, but this memorandum was the catalyst for the closure. All kinds of things happened before, all kinds of things happened after. And it would be a mistake to say that we played all of our cards right all the time. And
of course.
a major part of the last couple months for us has been self-reflection, analysis, and it's a part and parcel why there's been so much focus on the topic of strategy and tactics. What is effective? What can we reasonably expect as an outcome of our actions? But that being said, given what the camp was at the time, it was absolutely ludicrous but downright defamatory to publish this. But the second paragraph, and many other statements in here, that are to be brought out are those claims about crime. And they're claims around drug use in particular was one, drug selling, some claims around the potential for prostitution. Now, I don't know if the police actually found these incidents. There were very little citations given while on the site for this. Certainly they were going on. Certainly there was crime going on at the camp. But what is being omitted by both the media and the police and all of the government involved is the fact that these kind of crimes are going on all the time. And in particular, what concerned me the most, and what I'm still very concerned about, and I've heard the very disturbing information, is that there were minors that were being protected. There were minors that had a safe place to go to. And the police department kicked those minors out, back onto the streets, where they're now far more susceptible to drug dealers, far more susceptible to sexual predation, far more susceptible to gang violence.
Absolutely.
The police increased the potential for crime in minors by their decision.
Absolutely, and they also were well aware that the level of crime that we were having in the camp was minimal compared to what those same people have been engaging in downtown. The downtown merchants and business owners were some of the most enthusiastic supporters of Occupy because crime downtown just plummeted.
Oh, at a recent
while
city
the camp
council
was
meeting.
open.
Absolutely. At the hearing on the exclusion zone, the owner of the Davis asked the city council, why did you ever close this camp down?
He was enraged.
It was working. Yeah, he was very enraged, and rightfully so. There was, for once, in the, as far as I understand it, 10 to 15-year history of this problem, something that actually worked that was closed down.
Right. And it was working on so many levels, John. The high incidence of people with serious mental health issues. Now, we used to have good mental health programs here. We've ended most of them. So those folks are out on the street. We have enormous numbers now of people whose homes have been foreclosed on, people who have been working for 20 or 30 years who are out on the streets. And now they're subject to all of the same perils that the people that have been out there a long time. People living in safe houses take pills to go to sleep every night. Every night. I mean, this is America. We are not critical of that, but we are highly critical of someone who takes some drinks or takes some drugs to go to sleep when they're living outside under a bush and terrified of both the police and other predators.
Exactly.
So it's this whole double standard of how we look at things, and things like this. I love this memorandum. It shines such a light.
It's
on
a piece
the
of
whole
evidence.
parody of justice that was going on here.
Absolutely. And it really, to me, shows the connection between our attempt to work with the homeless and the political motivation behind Occupy. Many people accused us of kind of losing the focus by working with the homeless, but that itself, that statement that we've lost the focus, doesn't recognize the systemic nature of the problems that we're dealing with.
It's a microcosm going on in Eugene of what is happening nationally.
What was happening nationally, and the fact that what we were dealing with were the survivors of an economic catastrophe.
Yes,
and
these are refugees, basically.
Absolutely.
You know, they're refugees that are in a survival mode. And I know, when the council shut down, they made a grand show of we're going to open an Egan Center 7 days a week from 5 o'clock in the afternoon to 8 o'clock the next morning, and it's going to last through the winter. And they put a $100,000 budget under that. As you and I know, and as all of Eugene, I hope, knows, they opened that camp for 2 nights. And it was full. The next morning, the morning of Christmas Eve, they kicked all the people out back into the bushes. And it wasn't as if they thought they were going someplace else. The city had promised transition services, but when they asked all the social service agencies to come out, at first they didn't come because they had told the council they had no services to offer. Basically, they had bus tickets out of town to offer, and that was it.
And that was the only consistent thing. The police were given coupons for Greyhound, I believe.
Right.
And nothing else. So clearly the statement was, and we found a similar parallel with the exclusion zone, our solution is get out of here.
And John, I've talked to several people who've worked extensively with the homeless and worked for the city for many years. and they will not believe that bus tickets were issued to chase people out of town. And I thought, I gave them the documentation. I said, one, it came to John Monroe and myself through Lieutenant Camcar. It was at a city meeting where Terry McDonald said that he was the one that had the ticket administration. He'd put them out. It's not a secret that we have these programs, but for people to accept that we're willing to take the homeless and send them out of town, if they can't accept that, John, how are they going to be able to accept the other things you and I have been forced to accept, which are much more egregious?
Well, I think part of it is stealing an age-old strategy of those that kind of control this catastrophe, and that's just repetition, reiteration.
That's true.
If you tell people enough that privatizing their government will make them freer, they'll believe it, even as their Social Security is cut out from under them, even as their house is foreclosed upon. If you tell people that increasing police surveillance is protecting their freedom, they'll believe you even as the police continually infiltrate their privacy. It is incumbent upon us, and I think this is one of the central missions of any kind of dissidence political movement, is to repeat truth back to that system.
Right.
Is to continually say, no, these are not individuals who are being morally punished because they did something wrong. These are a group of people that we can identify throughout the country who are victims of an economic system that is haywire, that is deliberately designed to benefit only a few people, and that masquerades as the source of freedom. And we can look at these individuals, but it's exactly, in my mind, the same kind of group psychology that we saw with middle-class whites in the South, and frankly throughout the United States during the Civil Rights Movement. They didn't want to believe that Jim Crow was as bad as people were saying it was. They did not want to believe that the government, not the federal government, the city governments that they were paying taxes to, the state governments that they were paying taxes to, the cops that drove by their house and they waved to, were turning around and lynching, we're turning around and excluding, we're turning around and beating, we're making up evidence, we're framing black men to send them to prison. This was all fantasy and conspiracy theory until consistent evidence and the consistent brave efforts of civil rights activists brought this forward. What we now have, we continue to have issues of race, issues of gender, these are all continually brought up, but the specific issue in my mind is the issue of classism, is the issue of targeting poor, because the poor are a constant reminder of the injustice that is the basis of our financial system. And it also is the problem that what keeps this financial system going is not a magical world where people are competing and incentives are being put out, all of the stuff that you learn in an economics class. But what actually makes it work is a secret world of police targeting poor, and a secret world, or rather a very public world, but that's secretly controlled, of the media telling people again and again and again that this is working.
Right.
And what we got
Which
to
is
see,
erroneous.
oh yeah, it's absolutely, but this all is very obvious to people that support OWS from a distance about Fox News or about the federal government or whatever, but they don't want to believe it when it's in their own home. When it's their local media is lying to them, when their local government is covering over oppression, when their local police are harassing the poor, then they want to say, oh no, not in my backyard does this happen.
Right. I think, John, too, you brought out a very important point, which is this is a microcosm of what's happening nationally. I mentioned here, in downtown Eugene recently, we have increased our police force from 2 to 6. Okay, that will be completed this summer. Think about Iraq, where we went from a few soldiers to many soldiers. Okay, but what's not known is that the Midtown merchants are also spending $80,000 to hire a private security force. The Chamber of Commerce is spending more than that, much of which is paid for, incidentally, by our tax dollars, to provide their own security force, the Red Caps,
who incidentally are also armed with batons. They're not simply tour guides,
and they're untrained. And that's in addition to this tripling of the police force. Now, I transport you back over to Iraq, where we are saying, oh, we've reduced our troops over there. What have we done now? We've hired tens of thousands of private security people. We simply replaced our military presence with contractual mercenaries. That's exactly what we've done on a small scale here. You know, we have our police force, but then we have all of these additional people involved, mercenaries, if you will, who are involved with maintaining security, and it keeps the public from realizing what a dramatic cost we are incurring in the downtown. What if we use that money in another way?
Exactly. And this is a disturbing trend not only in downtown but throughout Eugene. The Department of Public Safety on the University of Oregon campus is trying to deputize itself right now. But the interesting thing about them is they would have full arrest power. They'd basically be police, but because of their strange kind of private security in relation to the university, they would not be considered state actors, which means they could not be sued for violating civil rights. So the only recourse people have to go after a violation of police harassment of any kind, and I've heard some not pleasant stories about DPS on campus, would be taken away. Would be taken away.
And again, John, that's identical to what we're doing overseas. The contracts are not contractors are not subject to all the international agreements. However, the military is.
Sure.
So we remove the military and put the ones who don't have to play fairly in place.
And for those of the people, you mentioned that there are a lot of people, particularly in your generation, that are kind of self-educating right now. A couple things to look into. One of the best recent pieces of research on this is Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine.
I am reading it as we speak.
It's terrifying.
Literally.
And it is a terrifying work that really analyzes the growth of this financial pyramid scheme protected by brutal police repression.
Yes.
And we're seeing that in this country right now. We saw it with the famous video footage of occupiers in Davis and in New York being repressed with pepper spray. We saw the police brutality in Oakland. And we're seeing this very underhanded, petty, but nonetheless very typical police repression in Eugene. Dating back, there are two other very interesting things I'd recommend anyone should go to Wikipedia and look up. One is, all capitals, COINTELPRO, which is the counterintelligence program instituted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation against all dissident movements. Black movements, anti-war protesters, everything that was potentially anti-United States was researched, and not only researched, but deliberately undermined.
Right.
The other side, and this is very important when we think about our media, is Operation Mockingbird. An operation.
I don't know.
This is a very interesting one, instigated by developed by the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA is probably most infamous nowadays for overthrowing democratically elected governments in Iran, in Chile, throughout Central America. They're very good for undermining democracy everywhere else on the planet. But one of the things they did to do so in our own country was to pay intellectuals, journalists, scientists to write specific articles in specific interests. And they weren't always typical neoconservative rhetoric. Often they were left-wing. They helped sponsor Jackson Pollock's art because they wanted to look more socially sophisticated and artistically sophisticated than Russia, which has a much better, and still probably does, history of art than the United States. But the point was that there's been a long engineered manipulation of both police on one level and then public opinion on another level to create a very specific situation. And we're seeing it on various levels. Macrocosm is exactly the word. What we're seeing in Iraq, Afghanistan, what we're watching in the destabilizations of Iran, Syria, Pakistan, these are typical attacks. If we look at our camp, what happened was and again, this is considered conspiracy theory by many, but we have documented pictures and stories around people that were undercover. We have countless stories of police dropping off ex-cons, stories of violent offenders being dropped off at Occupy with promises of free food and free clothes by the police, there were sites of the sergeant in charge of downtown personally dropping off people at our camp. This is exactly what was done in Afghanistan by the United States government to destabilize it when the Soviets were held there. This is a typical tactic. You go in, you create a disturbance, that disturbance eventually escalates to the point of being a public safety threat, and then you have the conclusions here, which are, with respect, we demand that you take immediate and swift action to ensure the safety of the men and women who keep our community safe. Those men and women who supposedly keep this community safe are the Eugene Police Department, who again sent minors back out to be victimized, sent a bunch of homeless out to freeze in the cold, and then personally targeted. And I believe you and I both at different levels saw unmarked police vehicles following us.
Of course.
And these are all things that people believe don't happen in this country. Well,
they do.
Welcome to the United States.
Yeah.
It didn't happen to many white middle-class people before recently, but if many African Americans, many Hispanics, and many dissidents, white dissidents who identified as anti-war protesters or anti-WTO protesters are used to this kind of surveillance.
Right.
I believe what Occupy has done, and in many ways it was inadvertent of Occupy, was it brought a lot of attention to people. A lot of people showed up expecting to have a good political debate. They did, and then they saw the underside of police repression.
Right.
They personally experienced, and now they don't believe, like you don't believe anymore. And while I theoretically didn't believe it, now I also have firsthand experience of what it's like to be treated like an enemy by our own government.
And you know, John, to a certain extent, I think we all have to accept some responsibility. Even in Occupy, we're so involved with this nexus where government and commerce meet and kind of obliterate the well-being of everybody else. But that couldn't happen either without some cooperation from those folks who are engaging a great deal of consumerism, from those folks who are comfortable if they're okay, even though they see others who are not okay, those folks who are driving gas guzzlers and supporting the wars overseas. There is a 50% responsibility that the 99% holds. And that applies also to our police force. And that's why I and many others, including you, have been so active and really forcing our council not to take the comfortable position of believing in the police force. You can only believe in any group of people if you give them very clear missions, and then you stick around to be sure that they comply, that they do what they've been asked to do. We've seen this with the downtown public safety zone. The council said, this is a risky policy. People could harass people. Therefore, we want an advocacy program. Alan Zelenka wouldn't vote for it until there was an advocacy program. 18 months later, that program was such a sham that not one person accessed it. It was a sham.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they said to Chief Kearns, you bring us back relevant reports. He didn't. He didn't bring back anything to substantiate who was getting exclusion zone tickets, why they were getting them. He does have the information that 78% of the people given them could not claim an address, which puts them rather out into the picture of being homeless. So we have that proof of discrimination. We have no proof that there was no discrimination. We have no suggestion that criminals were kicked out. We have a lot of proof that people were harassed for petty offenses such as touching a building
or nowadays
trespass.
Now we're finding out
street.
18 inches. If you're standing within 1.5 feet of certain buildings, they will fine you, cite you for trespassing.
And they can only do that because so many of the merchants and business owners here have signed over a letter that you know more about than I do. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's a proxy agreement, and basically what it says is normally, if you're trespassing, you have to call in a complaint to the police department, and then they have to come
That's
and
for
remove
when
the
people
person.
come in your store and are bothersome.
But what's happened now is if you spray paint, no trespassing on your side. Sometimes the cops will do it for you. Sergeant Fitzpatrick was known throughout this past summer to spray people, to spray no trespassing right next to people and then cite them on that, which is actually highly unconstitutional. I don't remember the Latin phrase, but basically you can't ever penalize someone for a law that wasn't in existence before. It's ridiculous. But this proxy agreement basically enables the police to always harass anyone that is standing within the building, within apparently, according to one of the red caps downtown, 18 inches of the periphery of that building. And here we are in a space that has throughout history been known as the public space, the downtown of the city space. It is the civic space par excellence where people are supposed to come and socialize and develop what we like to call culture. And really express themselves as a people, and they're being penalized for just being downtown, for just standing in certain spaces.
That was a contrived situation. This is not an accident. This is not just discovering that the law could be interpreted this way. This is going out and actively soliciting these letters from all these people to allow these shortcuts.
Oh, absolutely. And if you look at the pamphlet about the letter, it makes very big, bold letters about protecting your property and whatnot. And it's part and parcel, too, and it ties back to the kind of police perception on our camp. They looked at the camp and they saw a bunch of people that had been cited for trespassing downtown, smoking ganj downtown, because of lack of public bathrooms. People might pee in a bush downtown and they get cited for public urination, things like this.
Minors using tobacco.
Minors using tobacco, dear God. I mean, these things that have been proven. You can't fix them by penalizing people for them. You need to give them positive role modeling. Well, here there's a camp. There was, at least for once, something like positive role modeling. We saw a number of individuals. We both know a particular woman with post-traumatic stress syndrome, who the first couple nights of the camp was tearing stuff up and is currently now in a much better mental health space because she had a community to help balance her out. But what happens is with these petty little contrived offenses, people stack up criminal records of, and if you actually know the context, the record is a cop bugs you over and over again for existing downtown. But to anyone else that doesn't know the story, it says criminal trespass, public urination, criminal trespass, smoking marijuana downtown. And moreover, because the downtown still has this network charter school that offers maybe 3 or 4 classes a week, any place within 1,000 feet of that can be moved up to a felony. For having, and now we're taking kids and we're putting them into a felony system because we don't like them, because we don't want them in our downtown, and we're screwing their lives up. We are turning them into criminals. We're turning them into delinquents in our attempt to stop crime.
I know.
It's absolutely mind-boggling. And
and it was, John, it was such a moot point in the camp. Were they shutting us down because we were an effective protest, or were they shutting us down because we were a homeless camp? And I finally realized, because Eugene was so strongly behind Occupy, they were not going to be able, we're a protest town, they weren't going to be able to shut us down as a protest camp. They had to use the homeless, against whom there is so much prejudice and stereotyping, that they had to create problems that people associate with the homeless by dropping criminals off at our site, many of whom were not homeless, and using all that negative energy to close down the Occupy camp. So they shut down what was popular as well as what was unpopular by using what was unpopular. It was a brilliant strategy.
It was.
I give them that.
And it also comes back to mind because I know a number of the people that were very much against it and very much against our camp, both in the police and on the council, consider themselves Christian. But they also continue to apply this standard where if you've been a criminal, we will continue to treat you as a criminal.
I know.
And I testified on behalf of one individual who the police attempted to exclude.
I know,
and they continually brought up, oh, well, he's had this criminal record. Well, he served his time.
Yes.
I mean, we already know that the punitive system doesn't really work. We watch recidivism is ridiculous. But that being said, regardless of the critiques, he had served his time. Well, now they're attempting to exclude him because he served his time. The contradiction, I mean, the people that attempt to say our government is Christian nowadays, when it is so clearly bent on punishment and revenge and turning people from being systematically disadvantaged by the economy into criminals, is absurd.
And it's a technique that can't be supported financially. One of the merchants who was very much in favor of the zone said to me, well, Gene, you know, we just need to get more jails. And I said, did you read the paper this morning? Lane County, whose jails we use, is about to shut down 135 of the existing beds. We're about to have half of the jail beds we used to have because we can't even afford them. How do you think you're going to get more jails? He said, well, you're right. And I said, if we don't have enough jails to police people into, we've got to develop some other tactics. And we started proposing this idea of co-occupy downtown. You and Allie have started the Kesey Square along with Derek and Big John and some other folks, where you're trying to revitalize the downtown, claim public space for the people. I mean, I'm so happy when I go through, hear you playing the guitar and see the people playing checkers and Scrabble, and the police in this limelight, far less able to harass the folks who are participating in that, because again, Occupy and those of you involved with Kesey Square are shining such a light on it.
But nonetheless, they're going to continue to try to get their own. On a few different occasions, we have this Kesey Square Revival Friday afternoons, and within a block of where we have this, at the Kesey Square, they'll have an amazing amount of police response to a single minor incident, exactly when we're there,
I know.
to attempt to really
We saw
just let
that
us
happen
know.
right after a press conference that I held there.
A young man, I think the first time we were there, a minor was skateboarding. He said he didn't want to be searched. Police are not legally allowed to search a minor without parental consent. He was tackled. Multiple police responded on site, and he was jailed for several days as a response.
I know.
And just last week, we had, I believe it was all six bike police and a cruiser responded to a single individual out on the corner of Broadway and Olive.
It's an abuse of tax money and abuse of people.
Well, I mean, one of the most egregious cases, and in my belief, just a purely retributional, just pure petty vengeance. One officer, Officer Tom Schulke, who at one point was the second vice president of this police union and very much in bed with this particular corrupt little organization, had many complaints filed against him by Allie on behalf of several homeless people. Allie Valkyrie, on behalf of several homeless individuals who had been continually harassed by this guy. 2 weeks ago, Allie is standing, videotaping an incident of police harassment of a person downtown, and she places her toe of her foot onto the yellow kind of lower wall where a fence is built on top on the corner of Olive and Broadway.
Okay.
And right next to the horse head. And Officer Schulke cites her without warning for trespass for $280.
But they have to warn you.
They
once
certainly
first.
do. They certainly do. That's one of the many things that he broke.
And he cited her for
criminal trespass.
Criminal trespass.
Criminal trespass number 2. Which has a maximum of $500 and or 30 days in jail, but he chose to give her a $280 fine for touching her toe to a wall on a sidewalk. Now this, to me, I mean, this officer is just, he's in there in that same category with polling as just a complete abuse of the system. It's disgusting, and I hope that the police department does the right thing and take this guy off the streets. That being said, for all those officers on the force that are good people, that
and there
join,
are a lot of
and
them.
they're, I would say, easily the majority.
Easily.
If not, 3/4. I mean, I've met many good officers because I've been doing police liaison since September, but they are continually being pressured into doing this. And an officer like the sergeant in charge of downtown, or an officer like Officer Schulke, clearly has a vested interest, and I think it has a lot to do with this police union. But there are many others, and because these two officers have a lot of sway, they can make other officers do things. And those officers, all these guys that joined it because they wanted to stop real crime, because they actually wanted to protect people, have no choice and find themselves citing some minor kid over and over again, building up his criminal record and screwing his life over because of of an institutional
predatory nature. I talked to a man whom I know well from the camp who's developmentally disabled. He got a ticket for touching a building next to the downtown activity club. Great. He got a ticket for jaywalking. And then one of the policemen said to him, "I need to search you now. Is that okay?" He took it as an instruction instead of a question.
And this fellow, and I believe
so they found less than an ounce of marijuana, and he got 3 tickets in 2 days.
I know the fellow you're talking about. He's clearly developmentally disabled.
And a neat guy.
You don't need to be, and he's a great fellow, and he's being systematically targeted.
This is why, John, I think the work that you and Allie and others are doing downtown to assist folks in filing complaints through the police auditor. The office hasn't been terribly effective, but it also hasn't been well utilized. And I think if y'all get those official complaints in, then we have something to point to. People are afraid. I mean, if Schulte is so determined to have retribution against somebody like Allie Valkyrie, I mean, that was so stupid to take the activist that is most prominent in talking about this harassment and to harass her. I mean, that's a huge amount of personal
Yeah, I got to give him credit for having the guy had balls and doing that. I got to give him credit.
But I mean, that shows the dedication they have, the determination they have.
Well, I think we can say, and literally in the financial sense, many people are invested in oppression.
Oh, yeah.
They have their jobs invested on that, their property ownership, their business models, their little unions, their little councils, their little committees.
Right.
Don't work anymore.
Right.
There's been a study, and I believe it was commissioned under President Johnson, but I'm not sure. I have to check. But it's called the Iron Mountain Report, or the Report from Iron Mountain. To make a long story short, it's an analysis of the war economy and how so many massive businesses right now would collapse if we did not have continual wars. And so we keep building wars.
Right.
It's very
and
similar.
Unemployment would soar.
And unemployment and all these things would just collapse. And it's very similar with the police institutions. If we got rid of crime, if we seriously considered these issues, if we, decriminalized all the petty things like drug use, especially marijuana, and a number of the small crimes, we might start to hit a dent in the 6 million Americans that are currently incarcerated right now.
We've got more people per population in prison than
we've got a bigger,
any civilized country.
Absolutely. We are larger than Russia at the height of Stalinism per capita. We are higher than China is currently, and Russia is currently.
I know.
And
if there's something we do well, it's incarceration.
Oh, absolutely. And so there's a vast amount of money, billions of dollars put into this
system.
And when
was the big upswing in that?
That came around 1980.
Yeah, around the privatization of jails.
Exactly, a massive privatization throughout the 80s, and it began in California.
The 3 strikes and you're outlaws.
Well, the kind of models for that, a lot of those policies were put in California, and of course, the governor of California later became the president of the United States through the 80s, and then his vice president was president until 1992. So we had 12 years there of a very steady privatization. And then what happens? A Democrat comes in and continues it wholesale.
I know.
NAFTA was passed during Clinton's administration, which sparked the Zapatista revolution. And of course, the Citizens United case comes during, once again, a Democrat. We have 8 years of kind of soft fascism under Bush, and now we have a soft totalitarianism under Obama. It's the same thing. We've been so brainwashed by this left-right dichotomy that when we look out and we look at the exclusion zone, or if we look at the way that our camp was closed, we can see the same tactics employed by Germany under the National Socialists, in Russia under the Stalinists, in China under the Maoists, and currently in the United States under either party.
I know, and you know what's disappointing to me as an American is I see people in other parts of the world fighting these kinds of systems, giving up their lives. We won't give up our evening in front of the TV. I mean, it's really heartbreaking to me. I'm so disappointed in my own culture right now. I'm saying, why can we sleep through this? Why do we participate in this? Why don't we drop out of it, get vigilant, and play our responsible role? It's not just the police, it's not just the council, it's not just the corporation, it's not just the military. It's us.
It's us. And it's us waking up, it's us educating ourselves, and I think more than anything else, it's us beginning to show alternative solutions. Not just going after the problem, which is itself a task, but also giving new solutions. And these solutions we will be developing in the future. Thank you very much for tuning in. Take care. We're still on. So, thank you very much.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that?